After World War II, the dollar became virtually universally recognized as the global currency, basically playing the role in the world that once was played by the British pound, say in the 19th century or early part of the 20th. Central banks in virtually every country held as reserves to support their own currency gold and the dollar, leading to the very famous phrase, the dollar is as good as gold. Saudi Arabia and the oil countries adopted the program of selling oil around the world to any buyer, but only for dollars, and then parking those dollars in New York City banks or in U.S. treasuries. It became the focus. And there are enormous benefits to that. The United States, for example.
In this talk, Richard Wolff explains how the U.S. dollar used to be the global currency after World War II, allowing the U.S. to buy goods from other countries using dollars, which cost the U.S. very little. However, this is changing as countries reduce their reliance on the dollar. Wolff also discusses U.S. support for Israel, pointing out that most countries now side with Palestine and how inflation is driven by businesses raising prices to increase profits. He criticizes the Federal Reserve for raising interest rates, which hurts ordinary people while benefiting large businesses. He calls for more democracy in the economy, where decisions about prices and production would be made collectively, rather than by a small group of business leaders.
Was able to pay for the goods and services produced around the world, the French wine, the Japanese computer, the fill in the blank, by sending them dollars. Unlike in other countries, those dollars didn't come back to buy goods and services here. They held on to the dollar because it was useful to them to do so, which means that for 50 years, the United States was able to consume the produce of the world and gave them in exchange little green pieces of paper, our currency that cost us nothing and are worth, per se, nothing. The benefits of doing this were incalculable. You couldn't explain American economic well-being in the last 70 years without the role played by the dollar. That's all gone. Today, central banks around the world, depending on the numbers you use, hold reserves only 50% in dollar, instead of the 80 or 90% that was the norm as little as 20 years ago. And so the symbolic meaning of that is enormous. The financial meaning, the real consumption, all of that. Here's a second example. We are now in a weird situation. The United States supports Israel in Gaza. Okay, it's one of the few countries in the world to do that. Out of 195 countries in the world that are members of the United Nations, and I keep track of this, 146 out of 195 have recognized Palestine as a state in the same way that they recognize Israel as a state, or the United States as a state, or France as a state. The United States and its allies are the only ones left supporting. Last week, Spain, Norway, and Ireland joined the list of countries recognizing Palestine. The United States is the only significant support Israel has. Even the other countries that don't yet recognize Palestine give it at best nominal support. Perhaps you would want to make an exception of Germany because it has that odd history of being the place that operated a genocide against Jewish people. But the truth of the matter is the decision by Mr. Biden after the invasion of Gaza by the Israelis to give them 100% support, what is he doing? That wasn't even necessary. He is so wrapped up in the way the world was that he doesn't understand that the Palestinians have won the battle against Israel around the world. Right now, you can't run a ship through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal. Why? Because the Houthis, in sympathy with the Palestinians, have made that impossible. That has enormous effects on the world, on trade, on movement of shipping. And I can assure you, every Arab country, every Muslim country, and beyond, but right there I'm talking about, I don't know, half the world, are trying to figure out how they can be supportive of Palestine. Turkey has stopped trading with Israel, in part because of this. That's what their leader said. My heart goes out to the Israelis, too, because they are in the process of miscalculating with the United States how the world has changed, and it's going to impact Israel, which doesn't have the resources to cope with that, even worse than it is already impacting here in the United States. How valuable is NATO when three of its members, Ireland, Norway, and Spain, last week decide to go against the heavy pressure of the United States and recognize the Palestinian state? In and of itself, it's a small step. Symbolically, it's an enormous step. It shows we don't agree with you on one of the central geopolitical conflicts in the world, and we're going to do it publicly. And the reason, by the way, it happened is because the leaders of all three countries know what Americans don't want to face, which is the overwhelming majority of people in all three of those countries are siding with the Palestinians, not the Israelis, in the issues of Gaza. So that the local politicians had to act, not out of sympathy with the Palestinians, but to save their own political skin. Inflation means that prices in general are going up. Not all of them the same rate. Some of them can go down, but the general direction of prices is up. That's all the word inflation means. Okay, step two in the logic. If rising prices are an inflation, the next question is, who determines the prices? Answer: employers determine prices. If you're an employee, you've never been called into a room to participate in setting prices. That's done by the boss. That's done by the corporate board of directors, the leading managers. It's a tiny group of people. In our country, the U.S. Census Department lists employers 3% of our population. The other 97% are not. There's no democracy in inflation. A tiny group of people never elected to the job, which doesn't exist. It's simply understood that if you're an employer, you set the price. You raise it, you lower it, you keep it the same, your business. Okay, so when inflation means employers made the decision. Why did they raise prices? Answer: the same reason they do everything else, to maximize their profits. That's what makes a business successful. So we can answer the question, an inflation happens if and when employers see profit in raising prices. So they do. That means that inflation is a profit-driven phenomena that hurts the rest of the people who have to pay more for what they used to get for less. And it's great for profits because that's why it's done. All right, the minute you understand that, then you understand that we live in a system whose economic arrangement is the opposite of democracy. We don't democratically decide what things are going to cost in the store. We never did. We have an autocracy. We have an authoritarian economic system that gives a tiny percentage of the people control over the prices we all pay. When they run an inflation, and when we have a mass of people complaining about it, and that's been the United States in the last 2 years, we turn to an institution set up for this called the Federal Reserve, our central bank. And if you look at the charter of the central bank, one of its jobs is to maintain price stability. So right off the bat, when we have an inflation, we know that the Federal Reserve has failed to do one of the two things it was asked to do. So what does the Federal Reserve do? In the case of the United States in the last 2 years, it raises interest rates. Now, for the mass of people, this makes a bad situation worse. In addition to rising prices of my breakfast cereal and my haircut and my computer program, I now have to pay more on my credit card because the interest rate on my balance has just gone up. So this is a solution that makes the problem worse. It's not the only solution. That the Federal Reserve, in acting in that way, shortcut what should have been the debate. How do we deal with the inflation that the employer class has imposed on us? We might have remembered that a conservative Republican, Richard Nixon, on the 15th of August, 1971, confronting an inflation then, made the following decision, which he announced on TV. Any company that raises its price, we will come for you, we will arrest you, and we will throw you in the clink. And any union that raises your wages or tries to, we will do the same. He declared what came to be known as a wage price freeze. Did it stop the inflation? On a dime, right away, real quick. Did it raise interest rates? No, it chose an alternative policy. We live in a country which not only did not do what it did a few years ago, but acted as if there was no option. So we have lots of experience with that tool to fight inflation. But we live in a country that can't face most of its economic problems because they too function as distractions from these kinds of real issues. A few years ago, we had shortages. We couldn't get toilet paper. We couldn't get medicines of all kinds. We have shortages right now. The most popular nonsense spoken about shortages in the past was, ready? Supply chain disruptions. That's a euphemism. That's another way of saying shortages. Now, I can show you shortages across the board, all over the place, virtually every year since 1971. To assign to shortages some sort of role as evidence, at the very least, you'd have to show me that there were more shortages during a time of wage price controls than there were during all those years when there weren't price controls. Every policy designed to solve any problem turns out to have strengths and weaknesses. I'd be the last one to argue that a wage price freeze didn't have all kinds of problems, not particularly the shortages. The more powerful argument at the time, since I follow these things since that time, the biggest problem was escapism. In other words, there was an escape clause. You could apply for an exemption from the wage price freeze. So every corporation went to work, hired the most expensive lawyers imaginable and lobbyists to go to Washington to get an exemption for your firm or your industry. And that's that leads to all kinds of misallocation. I get all that. But interest rates have that as well. Interest rates have their strengths and weaknesses. One of the weaknesses of the interest rate is we've had elevated interest rates and they didn't prevent our inflation. We're still struggling with an inflation, and there are as many people now saying that prices are going to go back up as there are people saying that they're going to go down. So interest rate is not some magic bullet. It's not some guarantee, but it really hurts a lot of people and it helps others. The bigger your company, the less an interest rate increase is going to hurt you. The reason we have central banks, including the Bank of the U.S. and what later became the Federal Reserve at the beginning of the 20th century, was because when we left interest rates to the quote, free market, we got crazy volatility that was extremely dangerous to the stability of the system. We brought in the regulators, we brought in the institution to deal with the ineffectiveness and the danger of not doing it. We're stuck. We don't work well without a central bank, and we don't work that well with one. That's a contradiction, but it is not resolved by oscillating back and forth between the two, pretending when you don't have a central bank that getting one will solve your problem makes no more sense than responding to the failures of the central bank by extolling the virtues of a free market. You can't go with either of them. The reason we see the Federal Reserve having anxious meetings over the last couple of years in which the top news item that evening is they met and they either raised the interest rate or they didn't, or they raised it by 50 basis points and not 25, et cetera, is because the mass of people are already involved. There is a small smidgen of democracy because they're making it hot for politicians not to do something. We get rid of the boss inside the workplace. It won't collapse. We won't dissolve. The world won't come to an end, but we will be able to get everybody in a collective way to learn to make the decisions, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the revenue our production achieves. And I think we would then have in our economic system the foundational democracy that will give us a better chance of getting a broader democracy than we have now.
Thanks for watching. If you found Richard Wolff's analysis insightful and want to stay informed about the deeper economic forces shaping our world, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more thought-provoking content. Let me know your thoughts on his take in the comments below. Do you agree with his assessment, or do you have a different perspective? Share this video with anyone you think would benefit from understanding the bigger picture. As always, stay informed, stay engaged, and I'll see you in the next one.